All right. Hey, guys. So, in this video, we're going to talk about a study that athletes and I think hockey players in particular should know about because it appears to have made a massive difference in the stats of elite junior hockey players over in Sweden in really all of the major statistical categories we care about in hockey: goals, assists, shots on net, plus minus, and so on. So, the paper appeared in the Frontiers of Psychology and was authored by Tobias Lundgren and his colleagues, which actually included Markus Näslund, who used to be the captain of the team here in Vancouver, where I'm from. So we'll break down the methods and results of this study here and also talk a bit about how it resembles a breakthrough in sports psychology regarding this type of randomized controlled trial. So to better understand this study, I think we should start by giving a bit of a context of sports psychology. So one of the major problems in sports psychology is most people kind of assume the psychological skills sports psychologists are teaching work well. However, the problem here is that there's actually been very little evidence showing objective performance improvements. There's been more success with things like reducing anxiety in various psychological categories like this, but where the rubber meets the road for most athletes is actually objective performance improvements, and sports psychology's had a hard time proving this in well-designed studies. Now, there's two authors in particular who are important in the context here, Frank Gardner and Zella Moore, and in their work, there's two prominent themes. They were writing kind of in the early 2000s. And the first was just to constantly point out this efficacy problem in sports psychology. We need to prove that it works. And second was to actually promote a new type of training the mind based on what's called third wave psychology. So a new approach to psychological skills for performance, which was different than what was traditionally being done, which was goal setting, arousal regulation, self-talk, things like this, which many athletes are familiar with. And this is important because it's the third wave techniques which the authors use here in these hockey players. Third wave interventions, at least the ones that have been mostly applied to sports, come from clinical psychology, and particularly an intervention known as acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. The authors here actually call their training acceptance and commitment training based on this. What this targets is something called psychological flexibility. The authors in their lead-up say what they're trying to do is create psychologically flexible hockey players. Now, what does this mean and how is it different? Traditionally, sports psychology has targeted the content of an athlete's internal experience. So things like trying to reduce the levels of anxiety they're feeling, or if they have negative thinking, to turn it into positive thinking, all things like this, which involve changing the content of our internal experience. Now, third wave approaches and psychological flexibility in particular are different in that they just assume that the context of competitive sports is going to come with it a full range of emotions. You're going to have to perform in anxiety. You can't do anything about that. You're going to have negative thinking at times. Things are going to get hard this way, and you're going to have a lot of what we could call negative experiences or uncomfortable experiences at least. And the focus of psychology shouldn't really be on trying to change this fact, which it sort of is just assumed as part of the environment. And what psychological flexibility targets is the ability to sort of follow the process behaviorally, to stay locked in with our attention despite the fact that we're feeling all these things, despite the fact that we have anxiety or frustration or negative emotions and whatnot, and it's trying to keep the core processes of performance like task-focused attention and proper behaviors in this way locked in despite this range of experience. So this goes by the slogan from change to acceptance, and this is what the acceptance really means. The acceptance part of it means that there's just the context of competitive sports is often going to be uncomfortable in this way. We will feel anxiety, we will have negative thinking at times. So these third wave style interventions sort of again gained traction in the early 2000s. However, it's one thing to criticize traditional sports psychology, say its methods are wrong or whatever. However, you still need to prove that your interventions work in well-designed trials with athletes, which actually show performance improvements in these athletes, generally in a randomized control trial. So there's been several attempts to do this, and there's been some success. Most of these studies do show performance improvements in athletes. However, these are always subjective performance measures. So, for example, an athlete will rate their performance before the intervention, then rate it again after an intervention, or they'll have a coach do so. Or the interventions measure psychological markers of performance, like flow state or increases in attention and things such as this. However, what we ultimately want to know is objective performance. In this case, do the hockey players actually score more goals? Is their plus minus better? Do they have better stats? So the authors in this study are interested in this question. They want objective performance. They say forget about the subjective markers, forget about these psychological measures of performance. Let's give a third wave intervention to hockey players in a randomized control trial, and let's see how they differ in the stats that matter: goals, assists, plus minus. These are the things that you of course really would want to improve as an elite athlete. All right, so let's get directly into the study. The population and context, the particular performance environment of this study was, as mentioned, elite junior hockey players in Sweden. These were all male and they're all ages between 16 and 20, standard junior hockey age. I'm not an expert on sort of levels of hockey around the world, but what this appears like to me is this level is roughly equivalent to, say, the WHL here in North America. So of course this is quite an elite, quite a high level of junior hockey. Study takes this population and it randomly divides it into two groups. Group 1 is just a weightless control. So this is people are going to go through the hockey season still, but they're not getting any psychological intervention per se. And the second group gets the psychological intervention, which again is called acceptance and commitment training. What actually is involved in an acceptance and commitment training session? So it included 4 overall sessions. These were roughly an hour long. And in each of the 4 sessions, the focus was on one psychological skill. So psychological flexibility is the broad concept aimed at in third wave sports psychology. And there's 6 aspects of psychological flexibility. This training, acceptance and commitment training, focus on 4 of these: mindful awareness, valued action, acceptance, and commitment. So each of the 4 sessions would pick one of these to train. Now, of course, what the study wants to examine is what are the difference in the performance trajectories of athletes between those who did the intervention and those who didn't do any psychological training of any kind. So we can think of a performance trajectory as something like a stock. If it goes up, it's good. If it goes down, that's bad. And the performance trajectory is represented objectively here by the major statistical categories. Now the results here are actually quite fascinating as we see what are called significant interactions occurring between the two trajectories. And a significant interaction basically means the trajectories are different between the group that did the training and the weightless control that didn't do it. So we'll look at these briefly here. We can start with goals per game. The acceptance and commitment training athletes we see start at 0.37 goals per game. This then goes up to, after the intervention, averaging 0.5 goals per game, and then drops all the way down. So their stock sort of went down to 0.28 goals per game when they were no longer doing the intervention. Alternatively, the weightless, the group that didn't get an intervention, starts with actually a decline. Of course, they didn't do the intervention, but in the time that the other group was doing the intervention, their stats started at 0.2 goals per game, went down to 0.12, and then went back up to baseline at 0.2. So we see this is quite a different trajectory. It's represented by sort of a drop and then a rise back to baseline compared to the acceptance and commitment training group, which sees this rise in performance when they were doing the psychological training. So in all the statistical categories in the acceptance and commitment training group, this is basically the trajectory we see, which is a rise in stats after the intervention and then a drop when they no longer did it. What stands out in this study is that, of course, we see these positive effects from pre to post intervention. However, from post to 3-month follow-up, there's this major drop in these measures of performance. So how do we interpret this? One possible explanation, which is kind of what the authors go with, is we can consider psychological factors sort of like fitness. So the same way we have a physical fitness, we might have sort of a mental fitness where if we don't keep these up, you lose it. And that's a possible explanation for why this performance drop off occurred after the intervention. In the follow-up, is the athletes are no longer doing the mindfulness training and really focused on these processes. So moving into assists per game, we see acceptance and commitment training starts at 0.48. This moves up to 0.69 assists per game after the training, and then down to 0.47 again when they were no longer doing it. The weightless group remains sort of flat and a slight drop at follow-up. Next statistical category is shots per game. We see the same thing. The acceptance and commitment training group before the intervention was averaging 2.08 shots per game. This goes up to 2.75 after the intervention, and then back down to the baseline 2.07 shots when they were no longer doing the training. Again, the waitlist control very sort of flat. We don't see much improvement there. The final objective measure was the plus-minus category. Again, a very similar looking path. Acceptance commitment training group before the intervention starts at 0.72. This rises to 0.96 after the training, drops down to 0.45 when they're no longer doing it. The waitlist group starts with a drop and from 0.60 down to 0.38 and then flattens out to 0.31. I should say the way the numbers worked out, this wasn't actually what we call statistically significant, although it was close, but we do see a very similar trajectory either way to the other categories. All right, so finally to wrap things up here, if you're interested in the techniques these athletes were actually using in this intervention, there's a book I'd recommend. I'll link it below. It's called Mindfulness and Acceptance in Sport. It was co-authored by one of the lead authors of this paper, and in it you'll get kind of the history of the third wave movement in sports psychology, but also an applied section on psychological flexibility, which will cover the 6 aspects of it and both what these are and how you'd actually go about training these things in sporting contexts. So that'll be there if anyone's interested.